The notice is taped to the front door, not inside. Outside on the door of the house you grew up in, the door you've walked through 1,000 times, the door your dad's hands painted that specific green in 1997 and that nobody's ever repainted because it suited the house and suited him and there was no reason to change it. It's a legal notice from an estate attorney referencing your father's estate. And it has your brother's name on it as the sole administrator. Not both of your names. His name. You drove 4 hours this morning. Monday, 7:30 a.m., dark outside, coffee in the cup holder, 4 hours of the kind of thinking you do on long drives when someone's gone and you're still adjusting to the fact that they're gone. You were coming to help sort through things. That's what the two of you had agreed. Next weekend, that was the plan. You'd both come, take your time, go through your dad's stuff together. A week had passed since the funeral. You figured you both needed the space. Your brother isn't there. His car isn't in the driveway. But the notice is on the door, which means he's already been here and he's already filed, and the attorney's name at the bottom of the notice is not your father's attorney. Not the one your dad had used for 30 years. This is a different firm. One you've never heard of. You stand on the porch of your childhood home for probably 3 minutes just reading the notice. Reading it again. Running the math on what sole administrator means and what it means that your name isn't there and what it means that your dad's 30-year attorney is not the one who filed this. And here's the thing, you're not a paranoid person. You don't assume the worst. You're the kind of guy who finds innocent explanations for things before he finds suspicious ones. But the math on this notice only adds up one way. You pull out your phone. You take a photo of the notice. Timestamp on the photo, 11:14 a.m. on a Monday in October. That timestamp is going to matter more than you realize right now. We're going back to the beginning. So your dad's name was Frank. Frank Mercer. 68 years old when he died, which is too young by any honest reckoning, but Frank wouldn't have wanted you sitting around doing the math on whether it was fair. He'd have told you to get on with it in that particular way of his, not harsh, not cold, just practical. Frank was a deeply practical man. He'd worked for 31 years as a structural engineer for the county, the kind of work that's invisible when it's done right and catastrophic when it isn't, and he applied that same philosophy to everything. Do the job correctly the first time. Don't cut corners. Document everything. That last one is going to be relevant. Frank documented everything. He was the guy who kept receipts from 2004 in a filing cabinet organized by year and category. He was the guy who had a written record of every piece of maintenance ever done on that house, who did it, what it cost, what warranty came with it. You used to tease him about it. You find it useful later in ways you can't fully appreciate yet as you're standing on his porch in October. The house, the Green Door house, was Frank's, paid off in 2011. He'd bought it in 1989 with your mother before she left, and he'd stayed in it when she went because it was his and because you and your brother had grown up in it and because Frank was not a man who abandoned things. By the time your dad died, it was worth somewhere around $320,000. Small house by today's standards, but the kind of house that's worth a lot in a neighborhood that held. There was also the savings. Frank wasn't flashy about money. He drove the same truck for 14 years and bought his clothes at the same 3 stores, but he'd been careful his whole adult life, and careful over 31 years of county employment adds up. About $180,000 in a combination of savings accounts and a modest investment account. And the truck itself. And the contents of the house, which included tools and furniture and a workshop in the garage that your dad had built out himself over 20 years. He'd made a will. Of course he had. Frank Mercer made a will the way Frank Mercer did everything else, carefully, properly documented. He'd had it done by Arthur Klein, his attorney, in 2009 and updated it in 2014 when your mom passed away and a few specific things needed changing. The 2014 will left everything split between you and your brother, equal shares. The house was to be sold and the proceeds split, the accounts split. The truck and tools to go to whoever wanted them with the proceeds of anything sold split. Completely reasonable, completely frank. You've both seen it. Not all of it. You hadn't read every word, but in 2019 your dad had sat you both down at his kitchen table and told you he wanted you to know where everything stood. He'd summarized the will to equal split. Arthur Klein handling it. Here's the folder, here's where it is, here's Arthur's number. Very frank. Your brother had nodded and asked a few questions. You'd nodded and thanked him. You'd both left feeling like the conversation had been had and the bases were covered. That was 2019. Your dad died in September. And in the 11 months before he died, apparently, something had happened to that will. A codicil is a legal amendment to a will. You don't know that word well until this week, but you learn it fast because it's the word at the center of everything that's happening. Codicil can add to or modify provisions in an existing will. It has to be signed and witnessed like the original will. It's a real legal document. When it's done honestly, it's just how people update their wishes. When it's not done honestly, it's the mechanism of something else. The codicil attached to your dad's estate is dated November the 4th, 11 months before he died. Your father had already been diagnosed at that point. His diagnosis had come in August: colorectal cancer, stage 3, treatable but serious, the kind of diagnosis that rearranges everything about how you see the next 2 years. He told you and your brother in September. He'd been composed about it, the way Frank was composed about hard things. He'd said he was starting treatment. He'd said he didn't want to talk about it more than necessary. He'd asked you both to just keep showing up. Visit, call. That was enough. In November, 2 months after the diagnosis, after the first round of treatment had started, someone filed a codicil to Frank Mercer's will. That codicil was prepared by a different firm than Arthur Klein's. The attorney who prepared it is named Dennis Harlow, whose office is 40 minutes from your dad's house, not 3 miles from it like Arthur Klein's. The codicil has 2 effects. 1, it removes the instruction to sell the house and instead bequeaths it directly to your brother Marcus in its entirety. 2, it reduces your share of the financial accounts from 50% to 15%, with the remaining 85% going to Marcus, 15% of a portion of the estate. Instead of half of everything, the codicil has 2 witness signatures. It has Dennis Harlow's notarization, and it has a signature that is supposed to be your father's. R6 stated plainly, your brother removed you from most of your father's estate 11 months before your father died while your father was in cancer treatment, using an attorney your father had never worked with without telling you, without telling Arthur Klein, and apparently without telling your dad either, because the thing you're going to find out in 8 months of digging is that Frank Mercer had no idea this codicil existed. Your brother Marcus is 3 years older than you. You grew up close, same house, same school until you split for different colleges, the kind of sibling bond that's built out of proximity and shared experience rather than deep active choice. You'd stayed close as adults in the functional sense, holidays, some phone calls, helping each other out when something came up. Not best friends, not estranged. Brothers. Adult brothers, which is a specific and sometimes underappreciated kind of complicated. Here's what you know about Marcus going into all of this. He'd had some financial trouble over the years. Nothing criminal, nothing dramatic, just the grinding kind of financial trouble that accumulates when someone spends a bit above their means across a lot of years. A divorce in 2017 that cost him. Business he'd started in 2020 that hadn't worked out. He'd asked your dad for money twice that you knew of. Both times Frank had given it. Both times it hadn't fully resolved whatever the underlying problem was. Marcus had moved back to the area in 2021 into a rental 30 minutes from your dad's house. He'd been around more since then, visiting Frank regularly, which you thought was good. You'd been relieved, actually. In fact, you lived 4 hours away. Marcus being close meant your dad had someone nearby. In retrospect, and this is the part that turns in your stomach when you think about it now, in retrospect, Marcus being close meant Marcus had access to the house, to the filing cabinet, to the conversations your dad was having with his attorney, to the window in November when a man who'd just gotten a cancer diagnosis 2 months ago was, in all likelihood, more willing to discuss his estate planning than he'd have been before the diagnosis. You don't know yet how it happened. You don't know if Marcus approached Dennis Harlow or if Dennis Harlow had some previous relationship with your brother. You don't know how the signatures were obtained, coerced, forged, or somehow legitimately signed by your dad in a moment he didn't fully understand. What you know is that in November, 8 months before your dad died, a document was created that fundamentally altered where his estate was going, and that neither your dad nor you were told about it. And your brother's name is all over the filing. You call Arthur Klein. The same afternoon, you find the notice on the door. Arthur is in his office. He takes your call. And the first thing he says is, "I've been waiting to hear from you. I'm glad you called." He hadn't been told about the codicil either. Your dad's attorney of 30 years had not been consulted about the filing. He'd found out through the probate filing just like you had. And Arthur Klein, who is 71 years old and has been practicing estate law for 43 years, tells you he's seen this kind of thing before and that you need to get your own attorney and you need to do it immediately. So you go into the house, the notice is still in your hand. You have a key, always have, it's your dad's house. You were given a key when you were 17 and Frank never asked for it back. You let yourself in. And the first thing you notice is that some things are missing. Not everything. Not even most things. But specific things. The good camera, the one your dad used on his camping trips, gone from its shelf in the living room. The folder on the kitchen counter, the one Frank kept current documents in, the one that always had his most recent financial statements and the copy of his will, gone. The truck isn't in the garage. Parkas had been here before you. He'd come ahead of the agreed weekend and he'd taken things. Specific things. The folder, the truck, the camera. The kind of things you take when you're trying to get ahead of a process before the other party realizes there's a process happening. Warkus didn't take, and this is the thing that unravels everything, is the filing cabinet. You remember what I said about your dad? Frank Mercer documented everything. Every piece of maintenance. Every receipt. The cabinet is a 4-drawer metal filing cabinet in the hallway, labeled by category in Frank's neat engineering handwriting. It's heavy. It's locked. And Marcus, who knew about the cabinet, apparently either couldn't find the key or decided it wasn't a priority compared to the folder in the truck. You find the cabinet key in 30 seconds. Because your dad told you where it was. Years ago, probably 2018 or 2019, one of those conversations where Frank was being frank about making sure you knew where things were. You'd filed it away the same way you'd filed away his attorney's number. Back drawer of the nightstand in the guest room, where it still is. You open the cabinet, 4 drawers. Third drawer is labeled Legal. You pull it. And inside, in hanging files organized by year and category, is the entire administrative record of Frank Mercer's legal and financial life. Including, and here's where your hands actually go slightly unsteady as you flip through the files, a copy of his 2014 will with Arthur Klein's firm letterhead, equal split, your name, your brother's name. Both there, both equal, and beside it, every correspondence with Dennis Harlow's office, Frank's copies. The full paper trail of the codicil process, because Frank Mercer kept copies of everything, including things that were being done to him without his full understanding. There are 3 letters from Dennis Harlow's office. The first 2 are standard estate planning consultations. They read like correspondence that was initiated under the framing of a routine update given Frank's health situation. The third letter, and this is the one you photographed 4 times from different angles with your phone. The third letter is a confirmation of the codicil execution. It's dated November 4th. And in the details of the file, the bit of information that no one expected you to have because they expected you to never look in the cabinet is this. The codicil appointment was scheduled by Marcus Mercer, not by Frank Mercer. The invoice for Dennis Harlow's service was paid by Marcus Mercer. Your brother commissioned a change to your father's will. Your father's attorney wasn't involved. Your father didn't initiate the appointment. Your brother paid the lawyer. You photograph everything in the cabinet. 93 photos over the next hour and 40 minutes. You upload them to 3 cloud accounts. You leave the originals exactly where they are. You do not remove a single piece of paper. You close the cabinet. You lock it. You put the key back in the nightstand where it's been since your dad put it there. You walk out to the porch. You sit on the steps your dad sat on 1,000 times. And you call Arthur Klein back. Right, so here's what you learn over the next 2 weeks, and it's a lot to take in fast. Your attorney, a woman named Catherine Park, recommended by Arthur Klein, who specializes in estate disputes and who has the energy of someone who has seen worse than this and won. Catherine walks you through what you're actually looking at. The core question is whether your dad had testamentary capacity when the codicil was signed. That's the legal term, testamentary capacity. It means, did he understand what he was doing when he signed? Did he understand the nature of his estate, the people who would inherit it, and the effect of what he was signing? If he was in a mental state affected by medication, by the stress of a cancer diagnosis, by any pressure being applied by someone with access to him and a financial interest in the outcome, then the codicil can be challenged. The second question is whether the signature is actually his. Catherine looks at the codicil and looks at your dad's 2014 will and looks at some other documents you've brought from the cabinet. She says nothing for a while. Then she says, "I'd like to send this to a handwriting expert." She doesn't tell you what she thinks yet. But the fact that she's asking the question is itself a kind of answer. The third question, and this is the one that turns out to be the most significant, is the evidence trail. Who initiated the codicil? Who paid for it? Who was present? Whether Dennis Harlow conducted the proper due diligence for a client who was 2 months into a cancer diagnosis before proceeding with a major estate change. Whether Dennis Harlow's bar record shows any prior complaints. Catherine says, "The photographs you took at the house are exactly what we need. Don't touch anything else. Don't talk to your brother. Don't tell him what you found." 8 months. That's how long it takes from the Monday you found the notice to the probate hearing where it gets resolved. I want to give you a sense of what 8 months actually looks like because the summary makes it sound cleaner than it is. Month 1 is mostly discovery. Catherine files a formal contest of the codicil on your behalf. Marcus, who apparently didn't expect this, responds through his own attorney, a guy named Brandt, who is technically competent and emotionally bulldozing. Brandt's initial position is that the codicil was a legitimate expression of Frank's wishes and that you're contesting it out of greed. Catherine's response to this, delivered in measured legal language that you can tell means something much less measured, is to request the full documentation of the codicil process. Month 2 is the handwriting analysis. Catherine sends the codicil, the 2014 will, and 7 other documents with your dad's signature to a forensic document examiner named Dr. Tricia Rees. Dr. Rees has testified in over 300 cases. Her report takes 6 weeks. You don't know yet what she'll find, but you don't sleep particularly well during those 6 weeks. You go to work. You do the normal things. You call your dad's house phone sometimes late, still forgetting for a second that he won't pick up. That part has nothing to do with the legal case. That part is just grief. Month 3 is the deposition of Dennis Harlow. Your brother's attorney fights this. Catherine gets it anyway. Dennis Harlow is deposed in a conference room and his testimony is, and this is a word Catherine uses, which from her is saying something inconsistent. His account of how he came to represent Frank Mercer changes in 3 different ways across the 90-minute deposition. He says Frank called his office directly. Then he says Marcus called on Frank's behalf. Then he says someone from a referral network connected them. 3 different versions of the same event. All on the record. Months 4 and 5 are financial records. This is the grind part. Catherine's office subpoenas your brother's bank records for the 11 months before Frank died. She's looking for payments to Dennis Harlow. She finds 3. $800 and $350 spaced across October, November, and December. Your dad was never billed by Dennis Harlow. Your dad never paid Dennis Harlow anything. Your brother paid Dennis Harlow to execute a change to your dad's will. Month 6, Dr. Rees's report arrives. 48 pages. Her methodology, comparison of 14 known authentic signatures against the codicil signature across 12 measured characteristics, produces a finding that Catherine reads to you over the phone in her measured way and then pauses. Dr. Rees concludes, the signature on the codicil is not consistent with the known signatures of Frank Mercer and is, in her professional opinion, a forgery. Not uncertain. Possibly forgery. Someone signed your father's name on a legal document. Months 7 and 8 are hearing preparation. Catherine is thorough to the point of being slightly exhausting. She rehearses your testimony. She goes through every piece of evidence. She tells you the hearing will last 1 day, maybe 1.5. She tells you the standard of evidence in a probate contest is preponderance, meaning more likely than not. She says, we have a forged signature, a secret payment trail, an attorney who can't keep his story straight, and Frank Mercer's own cabinet showing the codicil came from your brother's initiative. We have a very strong case. She says this once and doesn't repeat it, which you find actually more reassuring than if she'd said it 5 times. The probate court hearing is a Tuesday in June. You and Catherine, Marcus and Brandt, Dennis Harlow in a separate seat looking like he'd rather be literally anywhere else on earth. The judge is a man named Judge Whitmore who has the bearing of someone who has spent decades reading the specific kind of human behavior that emerges in inheritance disputes and who finds very little of. It's surprising you don't testify first. Catherine calls Dr. Reese the handwriting expert. Dr. Reese the handwriting expert. Dr. Reese walks the court through her 48-page report with the calm expertise of someone who does this constantly. She explains the methodology. She explains the 14 characteristics she measured. She explains what each inconsistency means and why each one individually would be concerning and what 14 of them together mean. Her conclusion, stated once clearly, it is my professional opinion to a reasonable degree of certainty that the signature appearing on the codicil dated November 4th is not the genuine signature of Frank Mercer. Brandt cross-examines her for 40 minutes. He challenges her methodology, her experience, her conclusions. Dr. Reese does not waver. She is the kind of witness who gets more composed under pressure, not less. When Brandt finishes, Judge Whitmore looks at her and says, "Thank you, Dr. Reese, I found your testimony very thorough." Which from a probate judge is basically a standing ovation. Then Catherine calls Dennis Harlow. This part is shorter, but more brutal. Catherine walks Dennis through his deposition testimony, slowly, specifically, version by version, and asks him which version of events is correct. Dennis Harlow's answers in the hearing are a 4th version, which doesn't match any of the 3 he gave in deposition. Catherine presents all 4, side by side, on a printed exhibit. She hands a copy to Judge Whitmore. She says, "I have no further questions." Judge Whitmore is quiet for a moment looking at the exhibit. Then he looks up, and he looks at Marcus, who has been very still at the other table, and he says 6 words, just 6. "Counsel, I think we're done here. Judge Whitmore's ruling is delivered the following Thursday. The codicil is voided in its entirety. Your father's 2014 will is reinstated, equal split, both names. The estate is to be administered according to Arthur Klein's original filing, not Marcus's. The matter of Dennis Harlow is referred to the State Bar. That process is separate and runs on its own timeline." What you hear through Catherine over the following months, Dennis Harlow's license is suspended pending investigation. Whether that becomes a permanent matter is the bar's decision, not yours. You stop tracking it. That's not your fight. The matter of your brother is more complicated. The DA's office reviews the evidence. Catherine cooperates. That forged signature on a legal estate document combined with a documented payment trail and an attorney's inconsistent testimony is the kind of evidence package that gets looked at seriously. What happens from there moves slowly, as these things do, through a system that's not yours to control. You're not going to tell you it ends in exactly the way it should, because the justice system is what it is and outcomes are what they are, and sometimes the right outcome comes and sometimes it doesn't come cleanly. What you know is that the case was made and handed over and it's no longer sitting in your lap. Calmly, Marcus didn't get the house. He didn't get 85% of the accounts. He didn't get what he'd spent 11 months engineering. What he got was a voided codicil, a DA inquiry, a state bar referral attached to his name, and the knowledge that everyone in his family now knows exactly what he did. That last one isn't nothing. There are people who care more about money than reputation. Marcus is not one of them, which is the one thing you still know about your brother that feels like it might be true. The house sold 6 months after the ruling. Arthur Klein handled everything. The proceeds were split down the middle exactly as Frank had intended. You used your share to pay down debt and put the rest in savings. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that makes a good final line. Just the practical result of a thing being put back the way it was supposed to be. Where things actually are. Things. You don't talk to Marcus. Not by decision exactly, more by the natural results of what happened and what was revealed about who he is. You've had 2 brief, formal conversations about practical matters since the ruling. Both felt like talking to a stranger who shares your last name. You don't think about it constantly. You think about your dad constantly. Out Frank's cabinet. Out the way he documented everything, receipts and maintenance records and correspondence, all of it organized and labeled and left exactly where you'd know to find it. He couldn't have known you'd need it. He just did what Frank always did, kept the record. Did the job right. Made sure the evidence existed even when he wasn't there to provide it. The green door is someone else's now. It'll need repainting soon. Whoever bought the house will probably change the color. That's fine. It was your dad's door, not the door itself, that mattered. Here's the question I actually keep turning over. Not did Marcus think he'd get away with it. He clearly did, or he wouldn't have done it. Not even how do you do that to your own father. The question I keep coming back to is this. Frank kept those records. Like every receipt, every letter, every copy of every legal document in a 4-drawer cabinet in his own hallway. He kept them because that's who he was, thorough, careful, documented. He had no idea that same habit was going to be the thing that proved what happened to him. He wasn't protecting himself. He just kept the record. There's something about that I genuinely can't leave alone. The idea that a man's lifelong habits, the ones that probably drove his family nuts at times, the receipts in the cabinet and the label maker, ended up being the thing that defended his actual wishes after he was gone. That's not a lesson exactly. It's more like a fact about character. How you do things shows up everywhere, including places you never expected it to matter. What I want from you is this. Have you ever been in a situation where something you documented just because ended up mattering more than you realized? Not necessarily inheritance, not necessarily legal, anything. The photo you took, the email you saved, the habit someone told you was excessive. Drop it below. Genuinely. I read every comment in the first 2 hours, and I'm telling you right now I'll be there. Subscribe if this story stayed with you. Thursday. New story. Second person. You're always the man it happened to. And the next one. A man finds out his business partner has been running a parallel version of their company under a different name for 2 years. Same clients. Different invoices. Different account. He finds out because his business partner drunk texts him from the wrong phone. That one's Thursday. These are the stories nobody planned to tell. That's why they feel the way they do.